indeed an honor to deliver this Tarlok Singh Memorial Lecture before this very august audience. Sri Tarlok Singh was a pioneer who championed the cause of planning in India. His long stint at the Planning Commission since its inception and his role in formulating the first 5-year plan set the course for planning and overall development of the newly independent country. As chairman of the Indian Association of Social Sciences Institutions and the founder as well, he brought together the social sciences and fostered linkages between them. Given this distinguished legacy, when I was thinking of the topic on which I would speak today, I thought it was befitting to address in today's lecture some of the issues relating to development policies in today's world in the light of the conundrums and challenges that policymakers in this new age face. I think we are at a very special moment, momentous era, as it were, and how we steer the economy, ours and the world, depends very much on the type of policies that we adopt. And I would also have some comments on the types of policies that we have adopted in the past that have led us to the situation that we currently face. Values, norms and processes embedded in development paradigms influence development policies in deep and lasting ways and affect people's lives in numerous realms. In the period following the Second World War, the idea of a socialist state and the egalitarian ethos that permeated this paradigm led to 5- and 7-year plans emerging as an important tool for setting targets and allocating resources in the Soviet Union and several other countries. With the rise of the neoliberal ideology in the 1970s, and the role of the state got redefined and markets gained ascendancy. The year 2020 marks a watershed as the nature and depth of the COVID-19 crisis that the countries across the world have faced has disrupted the economies and lives of people in unprecedented ways. The process of recovery, even in 2023, has been sluggish, with global growth struggling to regain its momentum at 1% and number of unemployed rising globally to 208 million. The IMF's Edgar Morin, particularly in 1999, had used this concept and warned that there could be a polycrisis that can hit the new millennium. The European Union used the term with reference to the 2007-8 financial crisis, and the term gained popularity currently with Adam Tooze articulating it and the World Economic Forum, World Bank and IMF referring to it. The most commonly defined way the polycrisis is defined as crisis in multiple global systems will become causally entangled in ways that significantly degrade humanity's prospects. So it is not just one crisis, but there are several crises which are intermingled, and the impact of these combined interactions is much larger than what it would have been if any of these crises had hit the economies individually. What seems to be common is that the 21st century is going to be much more complicated than the 20th century, and it warrants a better understanding of the issue. Now, the Global Risks Report, you look at this. If you look at the global risks landscape, you'll find an interconnecting crisis, and the green indicates the environmental crisis that are hitting. The blue is the economic, the orange that you find there is the geopolitical, and the darker color red is the societal. So there are various types of crises that are hitting, and this interaction between these various crises is what is causing this phenomenon of polycrisis. One other fact that we need to take into account is that these global risks, this is the Global Risks Report, indicates that the next couple of years, what are the major risks in the next 2 years? They seem to be largely the cost of living crisis and the environmental crisis. But in the years to come, in the next 10 years, you will find all the green are the environmental crisis. So there is a huge environmental crisis that is emerging, and the next 10 years, if we continue the same path, business as usual processes, this is what is going to hit us much more strongly. The polycrisis impacts human development in multiple ways, and some of these have been highlighted in this graph that you have here. It affects economic growth, income, employment, social attainments, freedoms, access to services and opportunities. It also, however, this particular crisis is somewhat different, the polycrisis that we're confronting now, because climate change has complicated the issue in many ways that it has not been experienced any time earlier. Now there are two schools of thought regarding the polycrisis on what are the drivers of the polycrisis. Because if you want to look at development policies, what really drives and how is it that we address the development policy, we need to know what is it that caused this polycrisis in the first place, and what are the remedies that we can think about will emerge from the paradigm that you are speaking from. So where you stand depends on where you sit, as it were. Now there are two schools of thought distinctly, at least two. The first school of thought considers the polycrisis as a series of events that have emerged due to special circumstances, and hence attempts to correct for the anomalies that have arisen therein through policy measures within the existing framework. So while they recognize that business as usual will not work, the measures suggested to rectify the situation are not fundamentally different from what is currently being followed. Thus, the IMF calls for measures that can make the world greener, fairer, and smarter, whereas the World Bank provides support to countries in distress to build back better. The international agencies emphasize fiscal consolidation, a euphemism for stringent public expenditure controls that invariably lead to decline in the state support to social sectors, as demonstrated in several instances in the past. If we need any concrete proof of this statement, we need not look very far into history. We just need to look at the 1980s, when stabilization and structural adjustment policies that were implemented, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, led to either halting or reversal of progress on social indicators, so much so that the 1980s is widely considered as a lost decade for Africa. Now, if you look at the current situation, in 2021, 85% that is of the loans that were given of 107 billion that were negotiated between IMF and 85 national governments to respond to the COVID-19 crisis include plans to undertake fiscal consolidation. And the measures specifically mentioned in the agreements are austerity during the recovery period, wage cuts, public expenditure cuts, subsidy reform, pension reform, and rationalization of social assistance programs. As of March 2021, IMF had supported plans of 31 countries to reform their public wage bill. So you see, the policies have not changed over these decades or 3 or 4 decades, and the same policy prescriptions of the 1980s that led to the lost decade in Africa are now being implemented on a much wider scale across continents, and it is very likely that it will lead to a stalling of progress on social indicators at a time when support is much more needed. That's the question that we need to consider. The second school of thought thinks that the polycrisis is actually not separate crisis occurring concurrently, but a manifestation of the inherent shortcomings of capitalism, or more narrowly neoliberalism, to which I think the earlier speakers had referred to, which is seen as a modern form, stage, or mode of existence of capitalism. As you see, the UNRISD in its latest report of 2022 argues that today's extreme inequalities, environmental destruction, and vulnerability to crisis are not a flaw in the system, but a feature of it. Similarly, there are others who articulate the same viewpoint. Following this, If you were to look at the drivers of the poly crisis, there are 4 drivers that have been identified in the literature. This is still emerging literature, mostly 2022, 2023. So there might be greater drivers that will be identified later. But for now, at least there are 4 that are being identified and highlighted, which is inequality, on which we have been speaking since yesterday, overshoot, complexity and uniformity, as well as uniformity and globalization. Complexity, then uniformity and globalization have been identified as the 4 factors. Interestingly, and this is highly interesting, at the same time you will find as the labor income had declined, almost by an equal proportion or even slightly more, there has been an increase in the wealth of billionaires. And 70 to 93 million, according to the World Bank and UNDP reports, have been pushed into poverty, and there's rise in the hunger and undernourished people from 78 million to 829 million. But more important, I think, is how unfortunate calamity to make profits for itself. The patent regime, someone mentioned the earlier speakers. In fact, I'm grateful to all the earlier speakers for having laid out this scenario in such great detail that it makes my task much easier. The patent regime being what it is, public research that funded the COVID-19 vaccine research was utilized by the private companies, just 2 or 3 companies who between themselves made huge profits of $34 billion US dollars in the year 2021, which amounts to astounding $65,000 a minute or 93.5 million a day. At the same time, because of the high prices, the African continent was charged double the price of vaccine as compared to the European Union, whereas the income levels of most countries in Africa was half of that of the European Union. So this is the type of regime that we are now looking at. As I said, the global carbon inequality, you find here the top 10% accounted, this is the accumulated emissions of almost 50%. North America and Europe account for much of it, and you will find that the bottom 50% account for hardly 12% of the emissions. If you look at per capita emissions, the differences are much more stark. You will find that the richest 1% are the ones who actually are responsible for the emissions that we now experience and the climate change that we now experience, whereas the poorest 50% have hardly any emissions to speak of. Now, when you look at the COVID-19 situation and the way in which the world responded, I'd just like to bring to your attention the fact that the world was always not like this. There were some ethical values that governed collective response. The situation in the mid-1950s is, I would like to give as an example, when the global community harnessed science and innovation for public good. As hunger and malnutrition raged across countries, governments, international organizations and foundations joined hands together to establish the CGIAR, which is the Consortium of International Agricultural Research Centers, which is a network of global research institutions, which actually furthered the Green Revolution and provided a concrete solution to the world's hunger challenge. So it is this type of collective action. Yesterday also we spoke of collective action that was required. Professor Sachin Chaturvedi had also mentioned that. It is this type of collective action to come to the rescue of those in need which is required. Instead, what we saw during the COVID-19 period is the exact opposite of it. So the basic issue that I would like to flag here is the development without any ethical values that are underlying it will lead to some bizarre consequences that we are seeing now. This is the global regional average emissions, per capita emissions. As you can see, North America has the highest. And I would like to point out here that this part, this is the sustainable level, where 1.5 degrees, if you adhere to this level, might be able to adhere, reach the 1.5 degrees Celsius warming, global warming that has been agreed upon in the Paris Agreement in 2015. Most of the continents you'll find that, especially North America, is way beyond that level. This is the sustainable level for 2 degrees. Even if you were to look at that we can, if we are not able to adhere to 1.5, maybe we can, at least limit global warming to 2 degrees. Even that doesn't seem to be feasible with all these regions exceeding these limits much more, which means that emissions, there has to be a decoupling of economic growth from carbon emissions, which is happening but not at the rate at which it should, and the absolute levels that are there, accumulations, unless there's a drastic change in the lifestyles and the emissions, it will not come down. Now, coming now to this climate part, the crucial difference, as I said, is that climate change has also been happening since long. You would say, what is new? Ever since life is created, there has been change in climate, but the geologists, I'm bringing in different disciplines. Earlier I mentioned about sociologists talking of the polycrisis, and now I'm talking of geologists. They have arrived at a conclusion after examining the evidence that is there, that the earth has entered the era of the Anthropocene. And this is a very important development that has happened. This is irreversible, and we are entering 2 more boundaries. Last time when I spoke, it was 4 boundaries out of 9. Now when I looked up the data, it is 6 boundaries out of 9. So pace of climate change has accelerated, and you find this everywhere with increasing frequency of climate events. In fact, there's an interesting report by the Reserve Bank of India on currency and finance. You would never expect something on climate change from the RBI, but there's a full report of 21-22 report on currency and finance, which is on climate change, and there they say the year 2022 witnessed unusual rate of ice melt in Swiss Alps, as a result of which sea levels rose by 5 millimeters. East Africa experienced its worst drought. Southern Africa battered by hurricanes. Pakistan suffered devastating floods. Europe experienced extreme heat, undermining human well-being. And you can also see the Sikkim floods that we experienced recently, which were sudden. The year 2023 also witnessed more than 80 days of global temperature breaching the 1.5 degree upper limit for global warming that countries are agreed to in the Paris Agreement. We are all experiencing much higher temperatures in climate than ever before. The second factor that I would like to talk of after inequality, there is this complexity. I think this is an important aspect of the modern production processes that we see as an increasing resort to technological solutions to developmental issues. There is an exponential increase in the level of complexity of the economy over the years. Experts warn that increasing complexity imposes costs on the economy as the cost of supervision and maintenance increase exponentially. An example is the way in which advances in biotechnology have provided new varieties of crops and vaccines, but the flip side is that they can also be used to the creation of new viruses that can cause harm to society. The same goes with artificial intelligence. You know that it can be useful. So it is no longer a technology per se, but the way in which it is put to use that will require increasing attention. And this means that the requirement for people with complex capabilities increases. Basic education can no longer suffice. It has to be higher levels of education and more integrated education that will increase, that has a higher capability of people to tackle these complex issues. And more importantly, we also have policy makers who have to have the capacity and the capabilities to address these policy decisions that they make with interacting factors and the complex phenomena that they have to address. So one policy, one tool will no longer work. It has to take into account the repercussions on other policies. So policy making in this era requires a greater sophistication and a greater understanding of the underlying causes, and otherwise policies will fail miserably. And if they fail, the repercussions are going to be huge for humanity. There is also this rising interconnectedness, which is associated with hyperglobalization, which we talked about yesterday. Professor Deepak Nair mentioned about globalization. And you will see that over the era, over the years, there has been from 1986, just look at 2016, there have been greater interconnections between nations. Now, this is called the fourth era of hyperglobalization, in which world trade had soared much more rapidly than world GDP. Over the past 2 decades, merchandise exports to GDP ratios soared from 15 to 26%, and goods and services exports rose to about 33%. The rapid growth in trade since mid-1980s, often referred to as a period of hyperglobalization, was due to the increased export orientation of developing countries and the flexibilization of labor markets. This, along with technical progress, facilitated the fragmentation of production along global value chains. The era of cross-border movements of inputs and coordination of complex value chains along long distances brought markets closer and generated uniformity and interdependence on a scale not witnessed hitherto. With the globalization is based on the premise that each country produces commodities and services for which it has the comparative advantage. The system functions well as long as the conditions for free trade exist. With the emergence of geopolitical tensions and COVID-19 pandemic, the supply chains are seriously disrupted, causing huge imbalances across countries. The increasing uniformity across countries in their production and consumption patterns and the high interconnectedness makes societies more rigid and unable to tackle systemic stress. Globalization has also made people dependent on global rather than local markets for their consumption needs. Witness the example of India worrying about lentil supplies, dals, because of the geopolitical tensions with Canada. We import a lot of pulses from Canada, and with the tensions mounting, we wonder whether we will be able to meet our requirements of lentils because of this. And there are various other, for the chips, for example, during COVID-19, no longer are commodities and things produced within countries. They are being produced across countries, and any geopolitical tension will disrupt this much more. One other factor that I would like to mention, which I plan to mention along with income inequality. Why is it we all mentioned that income inequality rose so high during this post-World War period? But what are the underlying causes for it? There are many, but I would like to highlight just one relating to policy. As the countries developed after the Second World War, there was a hypothesis, I don't know how many of you are economists here, of Kuznets was also mentioned earlier, of a Kuznets hypothesis, which was based on the evidence of 3 countries over a long period of time, USA, Germany and England. And these 3 countries, he found that as per capita income rises, inequality will rise, but more importantly, it will start falling after a while. Therefore, there is a U-shaped, inverted U-shaped curve that was emerging. Now, this was presented in the International Economic Association in 1944 by Kuznets, and it took the world by storm. It also emerged at a time when countries were planning their progress, rapid economic growth, and this gave governments the assurance that they could go ahead with the pursuit of economic growth as a single goal without bothering about the distributional consequences. At least to a large extent, they got influenced by this finding, so-called finding, and therefore distributional concerns were given the go by. I'm not saying this is the only factor that affected such policies, but it played a large role in providing a theoretical basis for what was convenient for the governments to do. So, and this particular hypothesis, Kuznets himself had warned that it may not be applicable to developing countries because this rate of structural transformation in developing countries could be quite different from that of the industrialized countries which had proceeded through that path much earlier. So from agriculture, labor may not move to manufacturing as was done earlier, but it might move to services. And we all know that that has been the situation now. And this Kuznets curve, he said, was based on 95% conjecture and 5% evidence. And yet, people had adopted this. Why am I mentioning this particularly? Because I find quite a few young researchers also here. When we use what are called stylized facts in our research, you must be very careful, all of us must be very careful about what the underlying assumptions are. Very often we take the conclusion but do not look at the assumptions that are made. To make things worse, researchers applied the Kuznets curve to the environmental field. So it became an environmental Kuznets curve, saying that initially as per capita income increases, emissions will increase, but it will come down after a point. But the point at which it comes down is so high, at least in some of the pollutants, it's about $10,000 per capita. And that would be too high, and whether the earth can take that amount of emissions without completely changing the conditions in which the earth itself exists is something that we did not consider. So I would caution you on, all of us also, on the way in which we interpret data and the way in which we take these stylized facts. Coming now to the next one on, I just also want to say that the globalization, look at the share of labor. In this system, you find that as the countries gained through globalization, the share in labor income was actually falling, and this is another cause for distress. What are the conundrums then in this? What are the dilemmas that policymakers face in a situation like this? Managing uncertainty actually is one of the biggest issues, because policy making presumes that there is stability in conditions. Most of us look at macro modeling. You look at the investment, savings, and these figures, and come up with projections of what the growth rate will be, what the investment requirements are, what the savings rate should be, etc., etc. But that is now just not, it's much more unstable, because there are multiple crises and volatile global relations, and there is what is termed as an uncertainty complex that is being, that has emerged. If you look at the data on uncertainty, these are subjective perceptions and the appearance of words on uncertainty across the literature, which is computed by the National Bureau of Economic Research, the Economic Uncertainty Index, for 143 individual countries on a quarterly basis from 1952 to 2022. It indicates actually that there has been a rise in uncertainty very systematically over the years. So this uncertainty is caused by three things. One is the climate change caused by the Anthropocene and its interaction with inequalities, because in countries with weak institutions, inequalities can persist for a much longer time and create destructive inequalities, as Nancy Birdsall would call, or durable inequalities, as Naila Kabir would say. The second is the transition towards new ways of organizing industrial societies, which in terms of nature and magnitude of the transformations required would be similar to the transition from agriculture to industrial societies. So this is the way in which industrial society itself is changing, and we see it happening to a lesser degree in India, but to a greater degree in other countries, that the way in which work is being organized, the way in which manufacturing is being organized are changing completely. The third type of uncertainty arises from enhanced political and social polarization across and within countries. Now, importantly, uncertainty has been observed to be higher in emerging and low-income economies than in advanced economies, which is a cause that which is a factor that we need to take into account. And one of the reasons for this could be the nature and quality of institutions that can manage uncertainty and its repercussions. In developing countries, the impact of uncertainty on output is not only higher, but it also lasts for a longer time, whereas in countries with strong institutions, the impact is smaller and more short-lived. These results hold even when the data is controlled for the development and interactions with uncertainty. The next one that you look at is managing national and global goals. This is a tension that has been existing since long, but accentuated ever since the Millennium Development Goals, and more particularly the Sustainable Development Goals have been implemented. While the Sustainable Development Goals are seen as an attempt by global agencies to infuse ethical values into development process and thereby correct for the inequitable and unjust development that was taking place, the tension between the processes that are there in the individual countries, because the global agenda is based on values of equity, sustainability and societal action, and it is diametrically opposite to the prevailing ethos of market supremacy, profit maximization, and primacy of the individual consumer that governs macroeconomic policies in most countries. Moreover, there are contradictions within the SDGs. While we all pay obeisance to the SDGs, we must recognize there are internal contradictions. The goal 8 on economic growth is not compatible with the goal 10 of reducing inequality within the current paradigm. If the paradigm had been different, then perhaps it could have been compatible. It's not that they are not compatible, but here with a profit-oriented, individual consumer-oriented, market supremacy-oriented paradigm is not compatible with the reducing inequality, and we have seen that demonstrated for us over the decades. Secondly, and more importantly, I would like to flag this, particularly for the young researchers, there is a reductionist tendency within governments, which leads to a mechanistic focus on targets and indicators without adhering to the processes or to the underlying philosophy of the SDGs, saying reaching the farthest first and leaving no one behind. The result is targets are met, but the outcomes remain truncated. What Amartya Sen calls the achievement of culmination outcomes rather than comprehensive outcomes. What do I mean by this? Take, for example, the target of achieving long and healthy life, a dimension that is particularly cherished in the midst of the pandemic. The resort to vertical, target-oriented programs have led to reduction in child and maternal mortality, but have not improved primary health facilities or led to a reduction in morbidity that is a requirement for a healthy life. Similar is the case with the education system, which has been mentioned by Professor Acharya also. But the numerical target of school enrollment is met, but the quality of education remains poor, with children unable to read and write simple sentences even after 3 to 4 years of schooling, as the ASER survey and other surveys have indicated. In my view, the solution is not to abandon targets, but to instill a sense of overall development that includes both quantity and quality of services that are provided, which would require an overhaul in the approach and content of the program, along with monitoring methodologies. In the absence of this due diligence, we will end up with empty development using empty indicators. And this is a real danger, because targets are met, we say that we are developing, but you know the content of this goal or the achievement is very hollow. More importantly, we need data for monitoring. We need to collect data at local level and make it accessible to people, because even today we do not have data at the district level also, whereas the climate change requires you to have a diverse source of data at a most disaggregated level, which is also the taluka level. The other one on managing short-term and long-term aspirations, this has also been a tension which has been there earlier, but it has accentuated now. So with the climate change has come about because the repercussions that we are seeing today is because of the short-term view of the phenomenon, whereas humanity and its survival requires long-term thinking. The needs of the future generations need to be factored in on a systematic basis, even as the requirements of the present generation are fulfilled. This balancing requires astute planning and valuing the future in all iterations of planning. Now, in some countries, they have future commissioners, like in Singapore, who take into account the future generations' interests. Now, once again, the way we have arrived at this climate crisis is, I mentioned the environmental Kuznets curve. There are two other factors that I would like to mention in this context. One is that we have used the concept of weak sustainability rather than strong sustainability. Weak sustainability assumes that physical capital can be substituted for natural capital. And that has led to an unabashed substitution of natural capital, destruction of critical capital, of trees and ecology and so on, because we are looking at physical capital as a substitute. And secondly, we are also looking at positive rates of discount for the future. When your discount rate for the future is positive, it means that you are giving greater importance to the present generation's interest rather than to the future generation, and that has been another cause. All I'm trying to say is that the various deliberate policy decisions that we have made in the past have brought us to this precarious situation, and therefore development policy needs to be extremely carefully formulated. Similar constraints are also there when you are looking at short-term and long-term for human development investment, because education and health, as was pointed out, requires long-term investment of 20 to 30 years to yield benefits. It cannot be done in 5-year electoral cycles term. And unless there is You see, one example is the gross neglect of preventive health in most developing countries can be directly attributed to the fact that you are looking at short-term, conspicuous, low-hanging fruit rather than long-term projects that build capabilities. I will now go to what is it that I suggest, and after that briefly I touch upon the Indian situation and conclude. There are 4 R's in my opinion that are important for development policy to take into account. One is recovery, just recovery, resilience, responsibility and responsiveness. The just recovery part, where we need to look at how when countries are recovering, that it is green recovery, that it is something that ensures jobs for people, creates employment opportunities and reverses the process of impoverishment of labor. However, when you find that with the business as usual processes that are currently in progress, the UNEP has, United Nations Environment Programme has said only 18% of the announced recovery spending can be considered as green, and in early 2022 it was found that the response and recovery continued to follow business as usual pathways, with the Global Recovery Observatory reporting that a total of US $3.11 trillion were spent on recovery globally, and only 2.5% has gone towards green spending. So we are still continuing the same path, and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change finds that global emissions must fall by at least 43% from 2019 levels by 2030 to align to the 1.5 degree Celsius goal. By contrast, the current commitments will only reduce global emissions by about 7%. If we consider the situation in 2022, trends indicate that labor market recovery is quite strong in developed countries, though the developing countries continue to struggle to restore employment to pre-pandemic levels. The recovery has been slower in developing countries due to fiscal constraints and weak capacity to restore jobs and protect the most vulnerable. The worst hit are women, youth and those with only basic education. And this is particularly distressing, as in many countries the loss in jobs for those with a basic education level was more than twice as large of the impact on workers with more advanced education, and those are most in need of help. The next part on resilience, I think resilience is a term that is used in disaster management, but with the frequency and intensity of crisis increasing currently, building resilience has come to occupy an important position in the frameworks for just recovery. Resilience is required both for climate as well as human-related shocks. Rarely do countries have a plan B ready or plan C. Right now, what is required at the local level, we need plans for human development shocks as well as climate shocks to be prepared, and we need to adopt planning techniques that can anticipate crisis and prepare plans to minimize shocks. And second, we need to implement universal social security measures, including both promotional and protective in nature. The Manrega evidence indicates across 4 Indian states, the evidence indicates that the scheme helped to build resilience. The responsibility and responsiveness, first of all at the global level, the common and differentiated responsibilities have to be recognized. There is a concept of lifestyle for environment that was floated in the G20 India presidency, which prods individuals to take responsibility for their consumption patterns to adopt climate-friendly consumption patterns rather than destroying the climate. And at the individual level, community, and you also need collective agency, which is required for responsiveness. A community response has been very successful in Orissa as well as Kerala. In Orissa for disaster management and in Kerala for COVID management. I think the Kudumbashree women have done a remarkable job in reaching out to people and providing care with a very sensitive manner of not transporting everyone to COVID centers, but in the residence they have provided food and medicines and other supplies, including PPO kits, which the Kudumbashree women manage. It is because of the community structures that existed earlier. Countries which have strong community structures and social security structures are able to manage shocks much more clearly than others. For India, I will not dwell on this because you are all familiar. We are a country, middle income country with huge HD backlogs, and because of the magnitude, unless India achieves its goals, SDG goals, there is no scope for the world to achieve its goals. Multidimensional poor, and I would like to look at the vulnerability particularly, that we have a huge number who are vulnerable, and the human development attainments particularly very low, and no country has progressed from middle income to high income without at least 10 to 12 years of good quality secondary education, and this is the missing link in our development. I would like to say the vulnerability part. We are vulnerable to income vulnerability. About 490 people are either poor or vulnerable to multidimensional poverty. Climate vulnerability, India is among the top 10 countries most vulnerable to climate events. 8 out of 10 Indians reside in districts vulnerable to extreme climate results. And losses due to extreme climate events in 2000 to 2019 amounted to 79.5 billion. Because if we are not prepared for these climate risks, we will have no money left for development. And climate action vulnerability. Even if you want to take climate action, go to a more energy, green energy, you will find that India's coal transition alone will displace 73,000 workers by 2050. Most of them are in the low income and low human development state like Chhattisgarh and Jharkhand. So the human problem of just transition is really huge. The programs that we have, numerous programs. At one count we had about 300 programs at the block level that we counted in Maharashtra. With a large number of programs which are not coordinated with each other, it becomes very difficult to monitor development. Many of them are on entitlements, because this is something that is easily given, more conspicuous, and has electoral gains, but the long-term task of building capabilities has been neglected. India is low per capita emissions, but you find it's high for the top 10%. And then India has been in the forefront of announcing climate action. It has the Panchamrit principles that have been announced at the COP26 to achieve net zero by 2070. While several missions have been launched on solar, hydrogen, etc. The union government is proactive, but the state and local governments should accelerate the pace. I don't think there is much action at the state or the local levels where it is most required. So I will come to this now, conclude with the last two slides. What are the required shifts in development policy for the 21st century? Looking at the very precarious scenario, complicated by numerous crises and accentuated by the climate change Anthropocene regime, which will not go away, but will actually accentuate in the years to come. We have to move from a paradigm which emphasizes self-interest, profit maximization as core values, to something where equity and sustainability are the core values, from resource extracting and exploitation strategies to resource regenerating and nurturing strategies, from one-size-fits-all strategies to plural local level strategies. I cannot emphasize this more. You cannot have the same policy across the country, especially because climate vulnerability is different, income vulnerability is different, and the requirements are extremely different. And instead of treating people as passive recipients and beneficiaries, you have to empower people and make them and enable them to become active agents. The people know best what is suitable for them, and they have the cultural background. In the not so distant past, there were cultural values which nurtured nature rather than destroyed nature, and this is available in every culture. I'm not only talking of India. In East Asia, there is culture of preserving nature. In Africa, it is there. In Latin America, it is there. We have looked at many examples where nurturing nature, especially by indigenous groups, has been an important aspect. I think we need to accept those aspects of culture which we have lost and infuse ethical values into the development. For those of us who are economists, we need to remember that economics started off its journey as a branch of ethics and then branched out separately, and then as the engineering branch of economics took over, I think we have conveniently packed ethical values into a branch called welfare economics, and the rest of economics is, as it were, not bother about values at all. I think it is time to get back to those values. We need to formulate policies at all levels to factor in risk and move to dynamic people-centric human development planning rather than planning from above on financial targets. Factor in uncertainty, prepare contingency plans at local level, encourage public debate on financing for human development so that it becomes a non-negotiable feature Like for example, in Tamil Nadu, you cannot take away the midday meal scheme program ever. Any party that comes into power, there has to be a social contract, renewed social contract between the state and the people, and involving the private sector. As I said, build resilience and responsiveness at community level, support recovery strategies to emerge from crisis using policies compliant with culture, community, and conserving nature, encourage adoption of lifestyle for environment and circular economy principles to bring about behavioral change for sustainability. I also think the higher educational institutions and research institutions have to be engaged in research of local issues. This is most critical. I do not see any reason why the huge number of educational institutions that are there in the local areas are not engaged in research on their own areas, but take up data from other countries and other regions. Strengthen data management at the taluka level and build the capacities of statistical cadre at all levels, which is extremely poor at the present moment. Involve the private sector to a greater extent to accept responsibility and contribute to overall well-being of people and ecology. I will end with this quote of the President of the 77th session of the General Assembly. History will not offer today's moment again. Any late reaction, any hesitation, any missing of the strategic focuses would come with an increased price. Thank you very much.